Today, we will live a day in the life of a real Egyptian pharaoh. It is a little unusual because ancient Egypt is a very interesting topic. But in advance, we note that from the point of view of the pharaohs, our guest will be the most ordinary, unremarkable, and can be said pathetic. Unfortunately, everything related to ancient Egypt begins with the prefix possible, because even scientists with scientific degrees cannot be confident in predictions related to the history of Egypt. The reason is obvious. Time. Just think about the fact that for the ancient Romans, ancient Egypt was older than the ancient Romans for us. The most legendary Cleopatra lived closer to the first human space flight than to the time of building the Great Pyramids. Cleopatra was born in the 69th year B.C., and 1991 separates her from Gagarin's flight, and at the same time the Pyramid of Cheops was built in 2540 B.C., and therefore 2,470 years before the birth of Cleopatra. And in fact, Cheops pyramids are not even the beginning of Egyptian history. The first state formations on the territory appeared 1,000 years before in 3,500 BC, and the last records in Egyptian hieroglyphics were written in 300 AD. Just so you understand the analogy to equal ancient Egypt in historical longevity, the modern USA needs to exist for another 3,556 years. Not a bad number, is it not? So any material about ancient Egypt should be treated with caution. 90% of the caution, 90% of the records from that era haven't been found yet. And of those that have been found, only a fraction have been deciphered. Nevertheless, we have tried to select for you the facts which historians agree somewhere around 1324 AD, and Egypt is in the so-called New Kingdom era. By this point, civilization is 2,000 years old, and at its peak, our Tutankhamun ruled over Upper and Lower Egypt. He was only 18, but youth is no obstacle for pharaohs. Tutankhamun came to the throne at the age of 10, and in 3 years he was already making very conscious political decisions, albeit with the help of servants. Lower Egypt is a more favorable land in the Nile Valley, bordering the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt is located below and is mainly concentrated right on the banks of the river, because, as you understand, moving away from the Nile on a couple of kilometers in Africa, you'll find the desert. And yes, you heard me right. Upper Egypt is actually lower than the Lower Egypt anyway. Instead of reigning in Africa 6,000 years ago on the savannas due to climate change, the people of Upper Egypt were faced with desertification and were determined to survive. Scientists tend to believe that eventually the king of Upper Egypt, nicknamed the Scorpion King, conquered Lower Egypt. Egypt has been intact ever since, under the rule of our Tutankhamun, and is epitomized by the Quran absinthe, which is a combination of two crowns. The red crown represents the Lower Egypt, and the white Hajjat of the upper, often in bas reliefs and drawings. The pharaoh is depicted between two goddesses in separate crowns, who give them to the pharaoh, or as it is easy to guess, for ancient Egyptians, Pharaoh was even more than just a representative of gods. He was their guide and holy. The duty of every Egyptian was to give everything to Pharaoh, because the richer and more beautiful Pharaoh, the richer and more beautiful will be the Egyptian. Maybe not in this life, but in the afterlife for sure. So every day of the Pharaoh was a real ceremony. As soon as our Tutankhamun opened his eyes, the cronies immediately played Guy Mun of the Rising Sun for the whole neighborhood, special people. Organized a bath with rose water in the presence of the family, and those close to the pharaoh applied makeup, groomed his hair, and chose a wig, because except for a short beard, many pharaohs, including your Tutankhamun, shaved their heads and used fancy wigs with jewelry. And since the pharaoh was the personification of wealth, Tutankhamun looked like a walking piece of gold and precious stones. Then he went to the chapel of Osiris, where he prayed used incense and washed the statue on the way out. Tutankhamun left the doors of the temple open so that the grace would spread throughout Egypt, and at the same time he personally appointed the priests for the temple of Osiris as an extremely important place after a sumptuous breakfast in the dining room where, besides the pharaoh, the food was served to two statues of his ancestors. In the dynasty, Tutankhamun takes on the work, and this is the most interesting detail because with all the piety and worship of the pharaoh, ancient Egypt was a very flexible state with an advanced system of government. The pharaoh had a vizier, personal advisor, who bequeathed him solving working issues. There was a cabinet of ministers, treasurer, judge, chief of police, and other officials all kneeled before Tutankhamun, who after a hearty breakfast heard the reports. It is not necessary to romanticize the situation. The good half of the kneeling ministers were weaving intrigues, stealing, and doing their own things. The power of the pharaoh was absolute, but one man cannot cope at all. In many respects, the success of the rule depended on the quality of the advisors chosen by the pharaoh. Our Tutankhamun's father Etnatan recruited idiots and tried to organize a religious revolution and appointed Othan as the chief god instead of Oman, which people didn't like. Actually, our Tutankhamun was called Tutankhaten from birth for this very reason. It translates as the living embodiment of Aten, but after becoming pharaoh, our guy changed his course to the classical one, which brought Egypt power. The supreme god again became Amun-Ra, god of air, and Sun his temples reopened, and the residents began to receive funding. In fact, our Tutankhamun issued decrees like this at the morning meetings. In addition to this, huge attention was paid to trade. Egypt, like many powers of the time, was largely an agricultural state. The only difference is that the Egyptians used the opportunities of the Nile River to the maximum. They built canals, invented irrigation mechanisms, and as a result of this, food was plentiful. It was traded with neighboring Babylon, Assyria, southern African states, and of course, northern Greek. Right along the Nile River, the New Kingdom period is considered the most powerful point in the life of the Egyptian Empire. But Tutankhamun's father Etnatan managed to ruin the army and lose Syria thanks to his shitty advisors. Tutankhamun is thinking about going to kick the ass of the unwashed Het, but it's too early for that. But later Ramses II will do it. Our Tutankhamun continues to complete the army in ancient Egypt. There were no traditional barracks. The army was simply taken and settled in dangerous areas. Of course, most often it was a base because from the Ethiopians in the south of the threat is not expected. Inside the order was ensured by police officers who were either recruited from the conquered tribes or hired by the way. In addition to bows, and the army of ancient Egypt of the time of our Tutankhamun often met swords and chariots and penmen on the shelves. No one fought any more well as for the day of the pharaoh. After a grueling meeting, he went to rest. It was believed that during the rest, all the dreams of the pharaoh will have dreams. So next to him were on duty counselors who immediately wrote down dreams and decrees. Tutankhamun, when there were no dreams, the pharaoh just continued to give out orders. Mostly they concerned the construction of new temples, statues of ancestors, and other archaeological objects, and after resting, the pharaoh sat in a stretcher. The stretcher was taken by the personal guard, and our Tutankhamun was taken for a walk. During the walk, the pharaoh stood on the terrace and addressed with grace to all four sides of the world. The blessing was accompanied by the roar of trumpets, and all who heard it, according to the principle of dominoes, raised flags, fell on their knees, and prayed because it was believed that to catch this moment was a lucky ticket. There were even cases when thieves and murderers claimed that the sentence was passed during the blessing of the pharaoh, and in this case, the decision of the court was softened, and during the blessed speech of the pharaoh, it was forbidden to beat even animals. For such a case, even the death penalty could come, because the life of Tutankhamun was sacred, and the touch of the pharaoh was equal to a ticket to life. Very Rarely during a walk or resting in the garden, Pharaoh could call a child or an adult to him if, at that moment, Tutankhamun touches him, rumors will spread in a second, so you could become an official, a respected person, or even a priest, because Pharaoh never makes mistakes. Well, by evening, Pharaoh usually returned to the dining room, where he again ate with the statues of gods and ancestors. The food was literally placed with stones and apparently entrusted to special people to eat it, because after the food, supposedly not eaten by the gods, and the past pharaohs was brought out to the courtiers, the pharaohs entertained with dances by women and circus numbers. Well, and at the end of the day, Tutankhamun returned to the temple of Osiris, nodded to the priests left from the morning, and put the god to sleep. The doors were sealed until the next morning, and our pharaoh went to bed. Few things interrupted this same routine. Mostly it could be travel. Pharaohs like to change their capitals like clockwork. The same Etnatan founded the city of Ahitatan and called it the capital where our Tutankhamun was born. But after becoming pharaoh, he moved to Memphis and declared it the capital. However, even then capitals were called anything. The center of Upper Egypt was considered to be Thebes, which Tutankhamun visited quite often because the patron of Thebes was Amun, whose name our pharaoh bore, not far from Thebes in a place called the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun ordered to build his sanctuary, which became a tomb. But you know that for pharaohs, it is a common thing, and it was the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 that became a real sensation because its contents were almost untouched. The golden mask that was found inside became a symbol of Egypt and is surely known to everyone, but in reality, many historians say that the only memorable events related to Tutankhamun is that he lived and died, because this pharaoh was the most ordinary. His descendant Ramses would conquer Syria. His ancestor Hatshepsut would conquer half of Asia and build the whole country. Tutankhamun was an unremarkable pharaoh whose skin we've just lived through. If you want to see more videos about ancient Egypt, don't forget to give us a like. We would love to build the pyramids or look at the life of slaves. See you later, friends.